This is Holds to Heavens, a show dedicated to cosmos, to mythos, and to psyche. If you like what you're about to listen to, please consider leaving some stars or a review, or you can always share it with a friend.
There's a drive that human beings have. That's probably the most important of all the drives. Which is the magic drive. 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 Everyone has a drive toward magic, and in fact toward not only having a magical life, but toward being a magician.
Welcome to another podcast, this one on the weird or great conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn in Aquarius. The date, November 28th, 2020, and it's just a day or two, 2 days before the first of the eclipses to end this year as well. And so The Great Conjunction is the end of the world, or the beginning. End, begin, all the same. Big change. Sometimes good, sometimes bad. Agora said that. Fans of the Dark Crystal will know of the importance of the Great Conjunction. The alignment of multiple suns isn't possible in our solar system, unfortunately. But the meeting of the giants of our world is. When Jupiter and Saturn come together every 20 years, culture begins to mutate. Kings consult magi in a panic, and the promise of a better world is up in the air. When the two protectors of the outer reach come together, the zeitgeist gets a new hashtag. So there are some astronomers saying that this is the closest one since 1623. Others saying that it's the tightest since 1226. For me, it's the latter that I find more interesting because it was in air, not fire. It was also a time when Genghis Khan looked up and realized not only Jupiter and Saturn were aligning, but all the other planets in Aquarius as well. So after killing off 10% of the world's population, he called it quits and died shortly after. The Great Mutation Cycle, as Kepler called it, has a pattern in which it moves through the elements, or triplicities, counterclockwise, changing from one to the other about every 240 years. For instance, this conjunction on the winter solstice is in air. It's in Aquarius. And for the next 200 plus years, every 20 years, they will remain in air. Looking back, with the exception of the conjunction in 81, we are living through Earth times, or we were. And this is a transition period, a liminal back and forth. And once we move through this conjunction, it's air for 200 plus years. One interesting way of understanding where we are going is by looking back. And so it was since the 19th century, the early 19th century, all the conjunctions like mentioned were in earth signs, and we have completely, in that time, reshaped the planet, sucked nearly all we can from her, chopped, burned, poisoned, and polluted her body in trade for the modern world we live in today. Without the raping and pillaging of Earth, we would not be engaging with this material today. And so, looking forward to air, we have space and life to encounter out there. Virtual realities and life to encounter in there. And we also have some interesting remembering to do. I feel music, language, stories, oral traditions are all on the table. And of course, the healing powers embedded in each. All of which need air to travel. The two will come together at the first degree of Aquarius on the winter solstice. The Chandra symbol for this degree is a two-headed calf. It's the coincidentia oppositorum, the path Parseval walks between two peaks or polarities. And in a world dreadfully divided on nearly everything except our need for this machine, it's a prayer of the resolution of opposites, an understanding of paradox and tolerance. And out of this calf's poo grows something I predict will also play a massive role in the next 20 years or 200 years. And when it does, many glorious things will grow out of us as well. So in essence, we are dealing with an alignment that has fascinated and scared skygazers throughout the ages. You don't need a wizard to know the world is changing fast. Yet, it's helpful to have one around to help make some of the connections. And it's our responsibility to change with this alignment as well. It challenges us to take a look at the world we inhabit and ask the question, how can I improve it? How can I bring clarity to my language, to my stories, to my relationship to this machine? Also, how can music assist in the healing? We are the music of the spheres, musica universalis, singing and dancing, humming and vibrating, whistling that eternal song to the end of time. So don't be afraid of the weird conjunction. Just change your language, tell better stories, listen to greater music, and try not to listen to the fear-flinging star tutors about this being the end. This, my friends, is only the beginning. And so if at any point during this auditory journey you are about to go on, you find yourself pausing it to take some notes, thinking, wow, I've never felt so fondly about Saturn before. Consider making him proud by becoming a patron of my work. That's this podcast, that's also the writing that I do. You can be a part of monthly classes and parlors, and even become an astrologer yourself through patreon.com/Adam Summer. Even at the $1 level, you get access to all the patron-only shows and a chance to win a free reading with me. And if you don't have $1, totally understandable. There's a tight squeeze in the world right now. You can just, on your app that you're listening to this on, leave some stars or a review. And if you do, take a screenshot of it, send it to me, whether it's on social or email, and I will link you to the Great Conjunction class we're going to be doing tomorrow. Even if this is in the future, you can still get linked to it or any other class that's on my site for free, just for leaving a review and some stars. So, that's easy. This podcast is also brought to you by SolarFire, an invaluable tool for studying this subject. Use promo code SOMA on their site to get 15% off. And one last thing is I've been thinking about putting some of these podcasts on YouTube, but some editing needs to be done musically for YouTube to accept them. If you are interested in doing this, I will link you to recordings, or perhaps, depending on the amount of work, apprenticeship recordings as well, if you're willing to do it. And so email me if that is a skill set that you have and you're interested in doing it. And so let's find some little coincidences in our solar system between Jupiter and Saturn. The music that brought us in, the magic desire, the drive, is from Eminem's DJ that I love. You can find his mixes on SoundCloud. They're amazing. And then after that was Aromancius, a wonderful down-tempo group I recommend supporting as well. So why Wyrd instead of great? Well, if you've been with me for longer than a year, you know that every player in the boneyard, that's Saturn and Jupiter and Pluto and Mars and the nodes, we did shows on all of them over the past, 18 months. And the titles of all of those solo podcasts were Wyrd. That's with a Y. And so it is woven. It is said that tightly woven by the sisters beneath our feet have created these fates. And so for something as beautiful as a Jupiter and Saturn conjunction happening at the end of the most eventful year of our lives, on the winter solstice when the sun stands still, to me, is poetry. It's amazing. And there's also a rarity to it. Like I was mentioning before, for example, this astronomer Patrick Hardington says that you'd have to go all the way back to the dawn of March 4th, 1226, to see an alignment this close between the two of them. That one was in Aquarius. And then there's others. I've been getting this through Earth and Sky, one of the astronomy sites I'm subscribed to, that they're saying 1623. That one was in Leo. I don't know. Big deal. Rarity doesn't always mean better, but the 1626 one is of more interest to me because it was the last cycle of air. And so this big cycle, it's interesting enough that it happens every 20 years. Kepler called it the Great Mutation Cycle. Every 800 years, he saw that it repeats. So it kind of begins in fire, preferably Aries, and then goes on for 800 years. Yet the Persian astrologers, or a lot of medieval scholars like Abu Mashar and Barhiya, they said that it was 960. And that math works a little bit better for my mind as well, because it gives 240 for each triplicity. So 240 for fire, for earth, for air, for water. And where we're at is the transition from earth into air. It's an incredible way of tracking time, in other words. And these transitions, as we'll find out in this podcast, are a very big deal. For most of my studies of astrology, I've always felt that the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction was the Star of Bethlehem. And there's a lot of debate on whether this is true or not. That the Star of Bethlehem, if you're not familiar, it's also the Christmas star that appears in the Nativity story. And it's the wise men of the East, inspired by this star, to travel to Jerusalem. And they meet with King Herod and ask him where he who has been born King of the Jews. And they look all around for little baby Jesus. But where they don't look is the humble stable, right? And Kepler felt that this was like a nova of kinds, and there's, I think, like it was that Jupiter and Saturn created this. But there's also the fact that it was a comet, that it was some heliacal rising of Regulus with Jupiter and Venus as well. There's a lot of different ideas about the Star of Bethlehem, so I've kind of edited it out of my language, not seeing Jupiter and Saturn as that, but more or less a timekeeper of the Great Mutation Cycle. And this triplicity, or trigon it's also called, it creates a triangle in the sky. And triangles, being my favorite shape, relate to the basis of creation. The first line, becoming. The second line, abiding. The third, returning. And it just repeats throughout the 240. But it's also interesting to note that the oppositions continue this with an element that is compatible with the triplicity we're working with. So for example, these are all air conjunctions. So in 2020, here we are, but also in 2040, 2060. And then the oppositions that will happen in 10 years. Saturn remains in an air sign, so it will be Gemini in 10 years' time, but then Jupiter is in fire, so it will be Sag. And so it creates this lovely pattern of the hexagram, right? And it's kind of an unbelievable thing to think about, because first point, when you learn about this, is you may not know that on the North Pole of Saturn is a hexagram. And hexagrams tessellate. Honeybees are onto this. Indoles, or like in organic chemistry, that is the shape of things. And there's something about life that works within this shape, in other words. And the fact that the two of them basically are painting this in a similar way that Venus is doing it with a pentagram in the sky, we see that there's this structure of creation or beauty that occurs between Jupiter and Saturn in the solar system. And there's another one too, and I highly recommend, if you don't have it already, The Little Book of Coincidences in Our Solar System by John Martineau, because this is where he talks about it with these just very simple but beautiful models and then one-page descriptions of this. But there's something else that relates to the way in which number and geometry are universal, are infinite, are, in a way, if we could see into the mind of God, this is what we would probably see ticking around. And the other relates to the golden section, or phi, the golden ratio, and it is the synodic periods of Earth, Saturn, and Jupiter. And so, for example, as we know, the synodic period of the Earth and the Sun is 365. And then for Saturn, the synod is 378. For Jupiter, it's 398. Now, when you plot this, I know it's hard to hear it without seeing a diagram, but when you plot these 3 points around a circle and you look at the distances between them to 99.9% accuracy, you discover the golden section. Now, the golden section is the mathematical equivalent of beauty. We see it in flowers. We see it in the human body. We see it in music. We see it in arts. It's everywhere where we would say, that is beautiful, right? And so to me, both the hexagram and the golden section showing up within the dance of Jupiter and Saturn, it is an offering of like, this is the great work. We are beauty makers. We need structure for our epiphanies and to create temples within our being, that the two of them, how they shape culture and society, also shape us. And we can work consciously with this. Like as we move into this conjunction and open up a 20-year cycle, it's an invitation. It's an invitation for us to rebuild or to add on to the temple that is our body, mind, and spirit. Now, there's something about dragons as well I want to speak to. I mean, oftentimes you see Saturn riding in the sky with dragons pulling him along. And also, I think we talked about this briefly in the Eclipse podcast, but in alchemy, that all metals have dragons within them, right? And so the dragons within lead, which is Saturn's metal, I find really interesting in the sense that there's all these qualities to lead that teach us very clearly about the nature of the planet. So for example, when you slice lead, it immediately shines and has kind of a silvery mercury-like sheen to it, but it oxidizes quickly. So it has the seed of mercury or consciousness in there, but so swiftly it tarnishes. Kind of like when we experience joy or ecstasis, we have a moment of revelation, like it goes away pretty quickly, and that's the hard truth of this world, or Saturn's domain, because he governs the outer reaches of it, right? And lead, being his metal, it's the first and the oldest, it's the heaviest. For most, it's also the most uninteresting, but the alchemists love lead for a lot of these reasons. Like when you powder it, and there you are, you have lead powder, it instantly self-combusts. No fire needed. So the fire of transformation exists within lead. And so it kind of hints at the fact that doing the Saturn work is the work in our lives. And so how about this one and how it governs time, how tricky the dragon is within lead on this one, that any metal that goes beyond lead in atomic weight or number will either turn back into lead, or if it goes beyond and stays beyond, it becomes radioactive. This is how atomic clocks keep time, is tracking, measuring this decay. All right? And so that is a mind blower right there of radiation and lead being a way of keeping the best time that we know of in this sector of the universe. And so why does Saturn relate to time? There is one of them. And what about mythologically? That we know, or maybe you don't, but you're about to know, that Saturn as Kronos was an eater of all of his children, right? And every time they'd have a kid, him and Rhea, he would eat the kid. Until one day, she fed him a rock, snuck it in there instead of it being Jupiter. She whisked off Jupiter and brought him to Crete and saved him. And he consumed a rock instead. And speed ahead in that mythological story is Jupiter overthrows his father in the same way that Saturn overthrew his father. So we have a patriarchal story here, a line that just jumps down the line that I think ultimately the buck stops with Chiron, because Chiron being a son of Saturn as well, like that need to overthrow dad and his rules. It ends with Chiron, but back to Jupiter, it's a fascinating thing when you consider the solar system in the way that Jupiter, life on Earth, would not exist if Saturn had become the second sun. So most solar systems in the universe have two suns. So it's binary systems. I think that's the constant, if I understand it properly. And we have one. But it's said, and I don't think NASA or Neil deGrasse Tyson would agree with this, but there's a lot of theories out there that Saturn was to be, or was, the second sun in our solar system. But the eating of this rock densified it and allowed Jupiter to exist and grow. And so you have this transition almost of power. And what of Jupiter, right? And how it relates in these ways. Like, what are these potential dragons and these energies within it? Well, the metal for Jupiter is tin. And being that Jupiter is the great benefic, it's not the case with his metal. Alchemists were very into tin or aluminum. You see how much it's polluted our world to this day. Tin cans and aluminum foil, and how life-taking it is from us. But tin, not that interesting. And there's something as well about the nature of the planet Jupiter, where it's the biggest in our solar system, but it doesn't have a lot of mass, all air and gas. And it's similar to the signature in our lives of Jupiter. You see it in snake oil salesmen or politicians, just full of air and cheap tricks. That is not to say that Jupiter is just that, but like it's interesting. Like, where's the substance? Where's the heaviness? Where we get that with Saturn? And so the mixture between the two of them, when you create an amalgam with Jupiter and Saturn that is lead and tin, you get something called solder, and it's used in electrical circuits. All right, so oftentimes you see it in this like a spool, and it connects circuits together. That to me is fascinating. That when you ally lead and tin, or Saturn and Jupiter together, it makes connections so that a current can flow, or information can flow beautifully between 2 points. Soldering. And that is an incredible Aquarian idea. And it very much relates to our need to build, bridges, structures, and what will the world look like in 10, 20 years, 200 plus years. That is the work that we need to do. And so when we consider this in our own lives, we need to look at what we've got. Like, what is the space and the structure of how we're growing? Like, if we're root bound but happy, we're okay to sustain where we're at. But if we want to go bigger, if Jupiter is more powerful in this signature for us, we need a different place. We need more space, more room for growth, right? And we also must identify in a similar way mythologically between the two of them. Like, does the king or the queen need to be overthrown? Or is the governor kind to the kin of our kingdom? It's really a meditation of where do we want to grow and go in the next 20 years. So wherever Aquarius is at in your chart, the first degree is where this consideration takes place. It's an invitation of how we would like to rule our world, not being fear-filled, subscribing to those foolish star tutors, or as Ficino called them, petty ogres of nasty predictions of what's to come. I get it. When we face value, just peek at the world, it doesn't look too positive. But if we do this work, right, if we become the alchemists and consider that as the prime materia, as really what we need to do, anything is possible. This is the invitation to step confidently into the Aquarian age.
What's it for? Is that what you want to know? You want to know what this is all about? Is that it, Gelfling? You don't know? You've never looked at the heavens. Everything in the heavens is here, moving. as the heavens move. This is how to know when. That's what. Suns, moons, stars. Yes, the angle of eternity. That's how I know it's coming. How else can I make the prediction? 1,000 years ago, there was a great conjunction. I was there. 3 suns lined up. That's when the crystal cracked. That's when the Skeksis appeared. And the Mystics. Another great conjunction coming up. Anything could happen. The whole world might burn up. End of Agra. Better have your shard before that, Gelfling. Now, ask what the Great Conjunction is. What's the Great Conjunction?
What's the Great Conjunction? You tell me.
The Great Conjunction is the end of the world. Oh, the beginning? End, begin, all the same. Big change. Sometimes good, sometimes bad. Ah, there it is. Gelfling knows nothing.
Agra, what do I do with the shard?
Heal the dark crystal.
But how?
Questions, questions, too many questions. You want a shard? Here.
Which one is it?
Don't know. Don't know. Ha! Listen, Gelfling. There is much to be learned, and you have no time.
Agra herself, speaking the Great Conjunction wisdom. So now for a bit on the past. The triplicity shift, according to the wizards of old, is around 6 conjunctions. Paul of Middelburg, John of Lübeck, they talk about this, and I'm open to the idea. 6 conjunctions brings us in 100 years almost in each direction of a transition from, say, what we're going through, Earth, into air. I was always under the impression that it's just a couple. Like in the early 80s, 80, 81, we had the Libra one. In 2000, Taurus. And then now, air again, Aquarius. And so those 3, to me, has always been the transition. But the old wizards saw it as this. And according to Abu Mashar, these great changes are also seen at in religions, in society, when the succession of the 12 conjunctions ends. And so that's exactly where we are. 12, a Jupiter number, is how many conjunctions in each triplicity. And so what an amazing time to be able to experience this. No one alive, aside from those mythical monks meditating in caves, was around for the last triplicity change. But here we are, and we get to experience the transition into air. The last ones were in the Middle Ages, right? 1277, there was an interesting relationship to these ideas that was the year 1277 was one of the oppositions where Saturn was in Libra and Jupiter was in Aries, and there was this concept of conjunctionalism that was forbidden in a lot of Europe. And it related to the star tooting. It related to these predictions about the kingdom or the emperor, and it became, in a way, a witch hunt, as far as I understand it, around these conjunctions in the sky. And one of the ways of seeing it is the ones that were happening in like the Renaissance, for instance. Those were, a lot of them at least, were water conjunctions. But the one I'm talking about is about to be in Cancer. Like in 1503, there was a Jupiter-Saturn-Mars conjunction, and the whole idea from many of the astrologers is that this was the birth of the Antichrist. And so it's not just our generations that have an apocalypse or an end of the world in every generation. Like this, of course, goes back. And the Great Conjunction was one that astrologers would use very often. Fun fact, in 1286, one of the last ones in Aquarius is when eyeglasses were first made available. And you see this, like there's something really fascinating about the Jupiter-Saturn cycle, often with the oppositions between the two of them, where there's innovation and invention that reshapes the world. One of them, which we'll talk about in a bit in this show, is the iPhone, or I would also say blockchain within the cycle that we're in now. But I'm just really interested in this concept of like how our ancestors related to it. And there was, of course, so much fear around it. Like another astrologer, Richard Harvey, wrote in the Astrological Discourse upon great and notable conjunctions. This one is in early 1583, that it is the last conjunction that ever shall happen in the end of water, and we are most likely to have a new world by some sodanne, violent, and wonderful, strange alteration. And a lot of the predictions didn't come to pass. And so it created a lot of refutes around this, a lot of divide, and people feeling like astrologers should be shunned like a dragon's den. And yeah, like there was these predictions throughout the year of 1588 that there would be some accident caused by water. And it was just a few years after one of the conjunctions between Jupiter and Saturn in water. And what happened that year was the Spanish Armada was defeated by that strange wind that came. And that, it's a miracle, that story, when you understand it. It's like, what happened there? And it was a prediction, yes, but also perhaps the magics of Jupiter and Saturn. And so at the beginning of my studies of this cycle, and really of astrology as well, the late, great Kelly Lee Phipps taught me something that I've always paid attention to with the Jupiter-Saturn cycle, which relates to the conjunction at the beginning being the seed of the next 20 years, and then the opposition between the two of them being that innovation or invention that I was speaking about. And so his ideas, I mean, were vast. If you knew Kelly, like he was quite the almanac or ephemeris, walking ephemeris of astrology. But he felt, when we were talking in 2009, 2010 about this, that the iPhone or something more integrated into the body would be the innovation for this particular Jupiter-Saturn cycle that began back in 2000 during Y2K. And so the iPhone was new when we were having that conversation. The iPad hadn't come out yet. And what neither of us were aware of in that moment was Satoshi Nakamoto writing the white paper for Bitcoin and blockchain technology. And so looking back at the end of this cycle, the ones and the zeros and the speculation around Y2K and that being the IT boom or the tech boom, and then the white paper being released in the summer of 2009, and then the Genesis block, or so that was 2008, the white paper in the summer, and then the first Bitcoin that was mined was in January of 2009. And so this was the lead up to the opposition. And so an innovation or an invention that will change society. And so here we are at the end of a Jupiter-Saturn cycle with the craziest story yet happening within the crypto space. It's exploding, but also a lot of industry is adopting it. And the way I see it moving forward with this conjunction happening very close to the North Node in the Bitcoin chart on top of Mercury, it's like the next 20 years, everything is going to be on blockchain. Our whole world is going to exist on the backbone of this technology. And I stand by that prediction. And even though I don't really do predictions, but like it's an interesting one. You can look back. I remember talking about this with Kelly, that in 1980, 81 was when personal computers were coming out. And then you look to the opposition in 1990, like around then, 89, 1990, and that was when the World Wide Web was being created and made available to mass. And then by the end of the cycle in 2000, you get the idea. So it's a fascinating way of seeing it, especially within this transition into air, that you have computers very much clearly at the center of this story. And so space travel, sure, that's happening as well. But this computer element, VR and artificial intelligence, the singularity, that is the most curious to me, is the exploration of inner space. And there's a lot more that I think, could be, of course, considered and theorized and talked about within this. But these are massive cycles. These are tectonic, and they shape culture. In a similar way, like in the conjunction that happened in 1980, John Lennon, was assassinated when this conjunction was pretty much right on his north node, very close to his sun. So a lot of times in the past, like when you look at the predictions of the Great Conjunction, it's like death of the king. Well, John Lennon was assassinated, death of the king of peace or rock and roll. It's a bit of a stretch, but is it? Like, it's interesting, especially when you look at the conjunction in his chart. And the madman who shot John, Mark David Chapman, he was reading Catcher in the Rye when the cops showed up, and in it was written to Holden Caulfield, from Holden Caulfield. If you've ever read Catcher in the Rye, it's the protagonist who feels incredibly alienated from society. And I found that really intriguing because Jupiter and Saturn are the creators of culture. And so wherever that was happening in his own chart, or his relationship to the gods or to God in general, like it was thwarted somehow. And why John Lennon became the target of his madness, we'll never know. But he is another Moon North Node example for the books, just for the record. And here we are, right? Computers, technology brings the world together. Social media does. It brings the world together, but it's also tearing us apart. There's so much magic to it. It's our magic in the 21st century. It's in our phones. And my favorite thing about this tech, yes, it's the interconnectivity, but it's also the fact that I can have an entire library of books in it. I can have all of my music and podcasts in it, packed tightly in my own pocket, right? And there was this documentary that I watched recently about the healing power of music, and this guy who had a rare form of Alzheimer's that was pretty much a potato, a vegetable. Yet they decided to experiment with music. He was a lover of music when he was a healthy young man, and they started putting his favorite songs on headphones and having him listen to it. Nat King Cole and Coltrane and Miles and all this music, and he came alive. Not only started moving and was animated through the music, but it slowly over time allowed him to talk again. The healing power of music. And when we bring back this idea of the structure of beauty, the golden ratio and the hexagram that exists within Jupiter and Saturn, I can't help but think about like the music of the spheres, musica universalis, right? That there is this harmony in our solar system that you can see mathematically and geometrically. It's there, and it's not new. It's not an epiphany that we're having right now while listening to this podcast. Like Pythagoras was onto it. It's all baked within the quadrivium. And astrologers like Ficino was so onto this that he used it as a remedy with his clients. So he would basically use the chart, understand the afflictions, what melancholy or whatever it was afflicting them, and then he would compose music in accordance to the music of the spheres, and he would play it for them as a healing approach. Incredible, right? And Ficino, a man who was born with Saturn conjunct the ascendant in Aquarius, felt very differently about Saturn than a lot of fearful fledgling astrologers do. He felt that Saturn was hidden gold. The whole lead to gold idea, sure. But also he says that you can't neglect the power of Saturn. He is the most powerful of all. And all with him act according to his slowness. Highest of the planets, closest to the prime mover. Now, he did have Saturn on the ascendant, and he was a humpback intellectual. And so it's very clearly there. But what's also so beautiful about Ficino's story is, well, we remember him still today, and we look fondly back at him. And so even though the lot that he drew in that incarnation was to be a humpback or a hunchback, he still was a genius and was incredibly influential in Renaissance thought and arts. And it's the greatness of Saturn. And also I point you all to Robert Svoboda's book on the greatness of Saturn, which tells the Shani myth and through the Vedic eyes of just how important Saturn is. That music gives a soul to the universe. This is a Saturn truth. That music gives soul to the universe. Plato said that. And I think we could use some of that soul right about now.
Andy, take a look at this. What you mistook for the 4-H club, the 4 and the H are actually astrological symbols.
You mean like planets?
Why, yes, Andy. They stand for Jupiter and Saturn. Some of the others represent planets as well, but this particular part of the puzzle pertains to a precise planetary position. Jupiter and Saturn in conjunction.
What's that supposed to mean?
Well, historically, Harry, when Jupiter and Saturn are conjunct, there are enormous shifts in power and fortune. Jupiter being expansive in its influence, Saturn contracted. Conjunction suggests a state of intensification, concentration. What this indicates to me is the potential for explosive change, good and bad.
So when's the next conjunction?
December 21st. That's from Twin Peaks. Maybe you picked up the reference. So a bit on the future, I suppose. It is said that Masha Allah wrote at least 28 books on astrology, and in his On the Roots of Revolutions, he wrote about conjunctions, distinguishing between three main ones. The Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, which he calls the greater one, the one between Mars and Saturn, the middle conjunction, and the one between Jupiter and Mars, the lesser. We had all of those this year. And he states that if Jupiter is stronger than Saturn, it will signify good. That didn't happen this year. Jupiter in Capricorn, fallen, Saturn domicile, didn't happen. But if Saturn rules, it will signify detriment. Interesting. Here we are at the end of 2020. He then goes into more detail, writing that if the conjunction takes place in a fire or an air sign, dryness, sterility of the earth, and severity of the cold will follow. If the conjunction takes place in an earth sign, it stands for the destruction of seeds and famine. In watery signs, it will indicate excessive rain and pestilence. If the conjunction is near an angle, or even better on the MC, it signifies the appearance of the king or prophet from the direction of that sign. So Saturn, in this conjunction, has the upper hand, being it will be domicile in air. Let's hope that things don't get worse, that the earth goes barren. So many prayers, I say, to the water and to the fire gods. My goodness. Also, if you're not getting out there and seeing day by day by day by day, the two of them getting closer together, what are you doing? You have to see this process. Like, they're tightening their space between, and then by the winter solstice of 2020, they're going to be right on top of each other. And it's not going to be this way again until March of 2080. Most of us aren't going to be here. After that, 2400. And so definitely get out there and check this out. Like, it's a very important thing to take a peek at. And so, quotes, predictions. I don't want to be the petty ogre, as Ficino would say, about all of this, but the Aquarian themes that are pretty clear. again, like I was mentioning around computation and tech and VR and blockchain, like that's all there. But also there's something in the sights right now in the collective around science. And it's being questioned on both sides pretty deeply. On the left, it's biology, questioning that, throwing that all up in the air. And on the right, virology, throwing that all up in the air. I mean, it's a little bit of both on both sides, and of course it's more complicated than that. But the fact that like defund science is a thing, and not to say like I'm 100% pro-science. I think it has its faults. I think that science, especially in our field when it comes to astrophysics and astronomy, is amazing, but it also gets the whole use case or how astrology works quite wrong. It's like, I love Carl Sagan, but like it makes my stomach turn when I listen to Carl Sagan talk about astrology. It's like, you're so smart. How could you have such stupid arguments about why astrology doesn't work? Anyway, science is of concern, I think, over the next 20 years, because there's definitely an underbelly movement, and it's becoming even more popularized around the metaphysical, which is, of course, incredibly exciting. But it's very concerning when it comes to biology and certain things, and we shall see. We shall see. But like I was saying, if we could peek into the mind of God, we would see numbers and geometry in there, the universal truth. And the popularity, I think, at the moment of traditions, like the Hellenistic tradition of astrology, or looking back to Hermeticism and forms of Renaissance magic, like this is a thing right now. And it's a really exciting one as well, because it remodels the cosmos in a way, and it makes us think differently, but also live more magically. And I'm really into that. And so I'm very much keeping track of this archaic revival that's happening within the metaphysical arts. Again, crypto, I mean, it's unreal what's happening right now in accordance to the conjunction getting tighter and tighter and tighter, moving towards the North Node in the Bitcoin chart. So we're going to talk about this in the class on Sunday. We'll use the chart. We'll also use a lot of really other, I think, fascinating charts around this conjunction, both historically and looking forward. But that's one of the ones I know the best and I can confidently speak from. And that, I mean, crypto's only been around for a Jupiter cycle, right? January 2009 was the first Bitcoin again. And so here we are. And so many people are aware of it now. So much more are getting involved with it. And the implications of this are massive. And it's not just financial. It's going to change everything. And I do think so much will be on the blockchain that we're not going to own things in the same way anymore, and that it's going to liberate artists in a really exciting way too. And it's going to change the internet and turn it into 3.0, and everything is just going to have these decentralized angles to them. And it's really exciting when you begin to understand it more. And so that is an invitation of what's going to come in this air triplicity. And as humans, we come from the earth, or humus, like etymologically, humus and humans are linked, right? And we're also beings of light. We're luminous. And that frequency raises the vibration when we think of this. Like when we know the light within us, when we cultivate that light within us, it increases the frequency within us. And the more we do this, like the densification of earth and the air takes place. To me, this is the work. This is a huge part of the transition of the Great Mutation Cycle. And so entertaining that Chandra symbol again, first degree of Aquarius, you round up. Two-headed calf. Like, what is that? Well, there's science, right? It makes me think of Lucy and CRISPR and just experiments gone wrong, Shelley and Frankenstein. But it also makes me think of what grows from the poo of that calf. And if you have not seen Fantastic Fungi yet, the Paul Stamets mushroom documentary, you must. It'll change your relationship to the fungal kingdom forever. And specifically, like with this election, having already Colorado decriminalizing mushrooms for medical uses, it happening in Oregon, this is going to become a thing just like cannabis. The difference is that I'm way more bullish on the effects of psilocybin for healing the world than cannabis. I mean, cannabis is amazing for many things, but when it comes to mushrooms, that's a rapid evolution as far as cognitions, as far as intelligence, as far as getting into the heart. I mean, on all levels, it's neurogenesis to the max. And if this reaches mass capacity, if this becomes decriminalized in most places and it becomes a thing, exponential evolution is what I predict. Exponential. And our ancestors were onto this. I mean, they saw it as the food of the gods, the Mayans and the Aztecs did, even the Egyptians. And I would even go as far to say that the Indians in the subcontinent did as well. Cows are sacred. A lot of their gods are psilocybin blue. There's something very psychedelic about that culture, yet mushrooms are taboo. Even in Buddhism, like one of the stories of the death of the Buddha is death by mushroom. Like they're taboo. And there's a lot of different cultures that are mycophobic. And I think that might change. Like there's not just, the physiological and healing potentials of that particular mushroom. There's also how it can save the bees, how it can treat certain diseases, how it can clean up oil spills, how it can remediate destroyed forests. There's so much that we haven't even discovered about the power of fungi. And I think of mycelium, and then I think of the brain, and then I think of the cosmos, and then I think of the World Wide Web and the interconnectivity of all these nodes. And then I think of blockchain, and I realize they all look the same when you map them out. And so as above, so below, and this is an Aquarian epiphany. And I think this is another confident step into the age of Aquarius is awakening these networks and keeping them running, all right? And not holding people back from experimenting with their consciousness, not throwing people into prisons for doing such things, but actually decriminalizing it, like where I'm at in Portugal at the moment, and seeing what happens. Like actually a lot of good things come from that. And so we all know why the war on drugs is a failure. It needs to end. And I really do think that in these air conjunctions, that information will hit a critical mass point and it will end. It will be over. Like in the great transition of the age of Aries into Pisces, there was that declaration over the mountains and over the sea of Pan being dead. That Pan is dead. And what will that declaration be this time? Because the avatar of the age of Pisces is Christ. And so will it be Christ is dead? Well, obviously. But also how Christ won't save you in the way that you think. It's like we must save ourselves. We must really look at the situation that we're in. And nothing against Christ. Love Jesus Christ. But you get the idea that the idea of being saved and everything that we have done is just relinquished. It's like, no, like we are here. Now Saturn keeps tabs. Jupiter and Saturn together is a beautiful structure of epiphany, but it also has equal parts of faith and pessimism, or just, critique. Like it's in between. It's not blind faith. It's actually knowing. Like there's no need for belief when the two of them are spinning in the limbic, right? Like when it is that healthy. And there's this interesting idea around what I'm talking about as well, like with the Trinity. So we know the triangle that they do in the sky now with the conjunctions and the oppositions, creating the hexagram, but also you have the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. The time of the Father has happened. The Old Testament. The time of the Son has happened with Jesus. And now for the Holy Spirit. And here, not too far away from where I'm at, up in the Azores, there's these 3 tectonic plates that come together. And from the center of the earth comes this energy, this volcanic energy, incredibly plutonic, that bursts forth. And through that, there's this biogenesis that occurs where life forms just appear out of nowhere. And on those islands, there's this tradition that keeps alive today of the Holy Spirit. And there's a certain vibe to it. I'm really, really, really excited to go and visit this someday. And it's keeping alive the divine feminine. It's keeping alive the Kabbalah and the tree of life. It's keeping alive radiant contentment. It's keeping alive the lack of a need of someone as a conduit or an in-between between us and spirit. And I think that's the great point, that there's this, like the technology of our bodies, the technology of breath, the technology of these plants and alchemy and everything that we are, getting now. It's all here. All cultures, all information have come together through these machines. We have access to it. And what does the synthesis look like? That's one of the ideas for these air conjunctions that keeps coming up for me, is synthesis. What is that? Not the separating and everything into parts. Use our own art of astrology. Like, there's all these different branches of astrology. They're like, oh, what kind of astrologer are you? Oh, I don't really work with Western astrologers. I only work with Eastern astrologers. But these are all branches of the same tree. And so we're the roots and the branches of the same tree. And I think synthesis is the word for that. And I pray that in the times to come, that like if we're in the 3rd stage of the Holy Spirit, that there is this kind of awakening that occurs, and from Aquarius, the water of life pours back into the ocean. The elixir of immortality, this entangled life, starts to come online. The tin and the lead, the soldering, these connections that are made in the circuits, that's neurogenesis, new pathways to the imagination, finding home again in the anima mundi. And who knows, maybe someday we'll have an android president who actually holds up the Constitution. We'll be voting on blockchain, so there won't be any discrepancy about votes. And finally, the curse of Tippecanoe. If you're not aware of it, Google it. I'm not going to talk about it too much here, but the 20s. 2020 president, 2000 president, 1980 president, 1960, and the curse that goes all the way back to, it's kind of like the Niwat's curse, if you're familiar, in Boulder. Like, does it have efficacy? Is it real? Seems like it. The curse of Tippecanoe. And so whether it's the Biden or the Red King, we shall see. Because we need a new story. We need better songs. We need greater music and healing sounds to move us through this, to learn from the language of birds, to develop Grail speech, to fill the air with this greatness, to align, really, to the music of the spheres. So I bless all of our relationship to this mutation, and maybe not end up cross-eyed within this insane social dilemma. By the way, if you haven't seen that documentary yet either, I highly recommend it. And if we're only seeing ourselves in the black mirror and we're hearing divided echoes from our little chambers, we have issues. And so when we have issues, well, we must turn to Rumi. There are those who accept the law of Moses and not the grace and love of Jesus. Like the Jewish king who killed Christians. This is not seeing right. Moses is inside the soul of Jesus, as Jesus is in the soul of Moses. One era belonged to one. Then it was the other's turn. But they are one being. A teacher said to a slightly cross-eyed student, "Hand me the glass bottle there." "Which one?" "There are not two." "Don't scold me, teacher, but I see too. Smash one of them. Of course, both were broken. This is how it is when we see through the double vision of lust, anger, or some religious self-interest. A bribed judge cannot distinguish the one who's been cruel from the victim. A good prayer is, Lord, help us see both worlds as one. Lord, help us see both worlds as one. My goodness. Help us see Jupiter and Saturn as one. Help us see the left and the right as one. Help us see above and below as one. My goodness. If you enjoyed that, again, you can leave some stars or a review, send it to me, and I'll link you to the class we're going to do tomorrow at any point in time. And if you really want to learn astrology, if you want to be a part of a blooming community, you can go to patreon.com/AdamSummer and become a patron from $1 all the way up to $500, depending on your desires of learning. And they're both ways of supporting this podcast, and they're really important just for the overall morale of the show. And this podcast is also brought to you by Solar Fire. So if you want to really get deep in your studies and track Jupiter and Saturn throughout time, you probably need some solar fire. An ephemeris is nice, but it's much more challenging and time intensive to do it that way. So alabe.com, use promo code SOMA and you'll get 25% off of the program. I'm going to leave you with more M&Ms, actually. Check him out on SoundCloud, M&M. He's from Portugal. He's by far my favorite DJ, I think. It's just such beautiful music. The way he brings it all together and the voiceovers are very tasteful. And this one comes from his mix, Flower of Life. And it's a little strange at first, but just bear with it because by the ending of it, there's a message from this girl that I think gets straight to the heart of everything I'm trying to say. So as Hazrat Inayat Khan says, what makes us feel drawn to music is that our whole being is music. Our mind and body, the nature in which we live, the nature which has made us, all that is beneath and around us. It is all music. Musica universalis. Jupiter and Saturn's dance. Enjoy, and I will talk with you soon enough. Eudaimonia. Thank you again for listening to the podcast. Sorry I wasn't able to share the song. YouTube is a bit more strict than the podcast apps. So if you'd like to listen to the whole show, go over to Spotify, the podcast app, SoundCloud, or really wherever podcasts are found. This is Tree Theater. Ciao.